Chapter 59. For some time Vinicius had spent his nights away from home. It occurred to Petronius that perhaps he had formed a new plan, and was working to liberate Lygia from the Esquiline dungeon. He did not wish, however, to inquire about anything, lest he might bring misfortune to the work. This skeptical exquisite had become in a certain sense superstitious. He had failed to snatch Lygia from the Mamertine prison, hence had ceased to believe in his own star. Besides, he did not count this time on a favorable outcome for the efforts of Vinicius. The Esquiline prison, formed in a hurry from the cellars of houses thrown down to stop the fire, was not, it is true, so terrible as the old Tullianum near the capital, but it was 100 times better guarded. Petronius understood perfectly that Lygia had been taken there only to escape death and not escape the amphitheater. He could understand at once that for this very reason they were guarding her as a man guards the eye in his head. Evidently, said he to himself, Caesar and Tigellinus have reserved her for some special spectacle, more dreadful than all others, and Vinicius is more likely to perish than rescue her. Vinicius, too, had lost hope of being able to free Lygia. Christ alone could do that. The young tribune now thought only of seeing her in prison. For some time the knowledge that Nazarius had penetrated the Mamertine prison as a corpse-bearer had given him no peace, hence he resolved to try that method also. The overseer of the putrid pits, who had been bribed for an immense sum of money, admitted him at last among servants whom he sent nightly to prisons for corpses. The danger that Vinicius might be recognized was really small. He was preserved from it by night, the dress of a slave, and the defective illumination of the prison. Besides, into whose head could it enter that a patrician, the grandson of one consul, the son of another, could be found among servants, corpse-bearers, exposed to the miasma of prisons and the putrid pits? And he began work to which men were forced only by slavery or the direst need. When the desired evening came, he girded his loins gladly, covered his head with a cloth steeped in turpentine, and with throbbing heart betook himself, with a crowd of others, to the Esquiline. The praetorian guards made no trouble, for all had brought proper tessere, which the centurion examined by the light of a lantern. After a while the great iron doors opened before them, and they entered. Vinicius saw an extensive vaulted cellar, from which they passed to a series of others. Dim tapers illuminated the interior of each, which was filled with people. Some of these were lying at the walls sunk in sleep, or dead, perhaps. Others surrounded large vessels of water, standing in the middle, out of which they drank as people tormented with fever. Others were sitting on the ground, their elbows on their knees, their heads on their palms. Here and there children were sleeping, nestled up to their mothers. Groans, loud hurried breathing of the sick, weeping, whispered prayers, hymns in an undertone, the curses of overseers were heard round about it. In this dungeon was the odor of crowds and corpses. In its gloomy depth dark figures were swarming. Nearer, close to flickering lights, were visible faces, pale, terrified, hungry, and cadaverous, with eyes dim, or else flaming with fever, with lips blue, with streams of sweat on their foreheads, and with clammy hair. In corners the sick were moaning loudly, some begged for water, others, to be led to death. And still that prison was less terrible than the old Tullianum. The legs bent under Vinicius when he saw all this, and breath was failing in his breast. At the thought that Lygia was in the midst of this misery and misfortune, the hair rose on his head, and he stifled a cry of despair. The amphitheater, the teeth of wild beasts, the cross, anything was better than those dreadful dungeons filled with the odor of corpses, places in which imploring voices called from every corner, lead us to death. Vinicius pressed his nails into his palms, for he felt that he was growing weak, and that presence of mind was deserting him. All that he had felt till then, all his love and pain, changed in him to one desire for death. Just then near his side was heard the overseer of the putrid pits. "How many corpses have ye today?" "About a dozen," answered the guardian of the prison, "but there will be more before morning. Some are in agony at the walls." And he fell to complaining of women who concealed dead children so as to keep them near and not yield them to the putrid pits. We must discover corpses first by the odor. Through this the air, so terrible already, is spoiled still more. I would rather be a slave in some rural prison than guard these dogs rotting here while alive. The overseer of the pits comforted him, saying that his own service was no easier, By this time the sense of reality had returned to Vinicius. He began to search the dungeon, but sought in vain for Lygia, fearing meanwhile that he would never see her alive. A number of cellars were connected by newly made passages. The corpse-bearers entered only those from which corpses were to be carried. Fear seized Vinicius lest that privilege which had cost so much trouble might serve no purpose. Luckily his patron aided him. "Infection spreads most through corpses," said he. "Ye must carry out the bodies at once, or die yourselves, together with the prisoners." "There are only 10 of us for all the cellars," said the guardian, "and we must sleep. I will leave 4 men of mine, who will go through the cellars at night to see if these are dead. We will drink tomorrow if thou do that." Everybody must be taken to the test, for an order has come to pierce the neck of each corpse, and then to the putrid pits at once with it. "Very well, but we will drink," said the overseer. 4 men were selected, and among them Vinicius. The others he took to put the corpses on the biers. Vinicius was at rest. He was certain now at least of finding Lygia. The young tribune began by examining the first dungeon carefully. He looked into all the dark corners hardly reached by the light of his torch. He examined figures sleeping at the walls under coarse cloths. He saw that the most grievously ill were drawn into a corner apart. But Lygia he found in no place. In a second and third dungeon his search was equally fruitless. Meanwhile the hour had grown late. All corpses had been carried out. The guards, disposing themselves in the corridors between cellars, were asleep. The children, wearied with crying, were silent. Nothing was heard save the breathing of troubled breasts, and here and there the murmur of prayer. Vinicius went with his torch to the 4th dungeon, which was considerably smaller. Raising the light, he began to examine it, and trembled all at once, for it seemed to him that he saw, near a latticed opening in the wall, the gigantic form of Ursus. Then, blowing out the light, he approached him, and asked, "Ursus, art thou here?" "Who art thou?" asked the giant, turning his head. "Dost not know me? Thou hast quenched the torch. How could I know thee?" But at that moment Vinicius saw Lygia lying on a cloak near the wall, so, without speaking further, he knelt near her. Ursus recognized him, and said, "Praise be to Christ. But do not wake her, Lord." Vinicius, kneeling down, gazed at her through his tears. In spite of the darkness he could distinguish her face, which seemed to him as pale as alabaster, and her emaciated arms. At that sight he was seized by a love which was like a rending pain, a love which shook his soul to its uttermost depth, and which at the same time was so full of pity, respect, and homage that he fell on his face, and pressed to his lips the hem of the cloak on which rested the head dearer to him than all else on earth. Ursus looked at Vinicius for a long time in silence, but at last he pulled his tunic. "Lord," asked he, "how didst thou come, and hast thou come here to save her?" Vinicius roused, and struggled for a time with his emotion. "Show me the means," replied he. "I thought that thou wouldst find them, Lord. Only one method came to my head." Here he turned toward the grating in the wall, as if in answer to himself, and said, "In that way, but there are soldiers outside. 100 praetorians. Then we cannot pass?" "No." The Lygian rubbed his forehead, and asked again, "How didst thou enter?" "I have a tessera from the overseer of the putrid pits." Then Vinicius stopped suddenly, as if some idea had flashed through his head. "By the passion of the Redeemer," said he, in a hurried voice, "I will stay here. Let her take my tessera. She can wrap her head in a cloth, cover her shoulders with a mantle, and pass out." Among the slaves who carry out corpses there are several youths not full grown, hence the praetorians will not notice her, and once at the house of Petronius she is safe. But the Lygian dropped his head on his breast, and said, "She would not consent, for she loves thee. Besides, she is sick, and unable to stand alone." "If thou and the noble Petronius cannot save her from prison, who can?" said he, after a while. "Christ alone." Then both were silent. Christ could save all Christians, thought the Lygian, in his simple heart, but since he does not save them, it is clear that the hour of torture and death has come. He accepted it for himself, but was grieved to the depth of his soul for that child who had grown up in his arms, and whom he loved beyond life. Vinicius knelt again near Lygia. Through the grating in the wall moonbeams came in, and gave better light than the one candle burning yet over the entrance. Lygia opened her eyes now, and said, placing her feverish hand on the arm of Vinicius, "I see thee, I knew that thou wouldst come." He seized her hands, pressed them to his forehead and his heart, raised her somewhat, and held her to his breast. "I have come, dearest. May Christ guard and free thee, beloved Lygia." He could say no more, for the heart began to whine in his breast from pain and love, and he would not show pain in her presence. "I am sick, Marcus," said Lygia, "and I must die either on the arena or here in prison. I have prayed to see thee before death. Thou hast come, Christ has heard me." Unable to utter a word yet, he pressed her to his bosom, and she continued, "I saw thee through the window in the Tulianum. I saw that thou hadst the wish to come to me. Now the Redeemer has given me a moment of consciousness, so that we may take farewell of each other. I am going to him, Marcus, but I love thee, and shall love always." Vinicius conquered himself, he stifled his pain and began to speak in a voice which he tried to make calm. "No, dear Lygia, thou wilt not die. The apostle commanded me to believe, and he promised to pray for thee. He knew Christ, Christ loved him and will not refuse him. Hadst thou to die, Peter would not have commanded me to be confident, but he said, have confidence. No, Lygia, Christ will have mercy. He does not wish thy death. He will not permit it. I swear to thee by the name of the Redeemer that Peter is praying for thee." Silence followed. The one candle hanging above the entrance went out, but moonlight entered through the whole opening. In the opposite corner of the cellar a child whined and was silent. From outside came the voices of praetorians, who, after watching their turn out, were playing under the wall at Scripto Duodecim. "O Marcus," said Ligia, "Christ himself called to the Father, remove this bitter cup from me. Still he drank it. Christ himself died on the cross, and thousands are perishing for his sake. Why, then, should he spare me alone? Who am I, Marcus? I have heard Peter say that he too would die in torture. Who am I, compared with Peter? When the praetorians came to us, I dreaded death and torture, but I dread them no longer. See what a terrible prison this is, but I am going to heaven. Think of it, Caesar is here, but there the Redeemer, kind and merciful. And there is no death there. Thou lovest me, think, then, how happy I shall be. Oh, dear Marcus, think that thou wilt come to me there." Here she stopped to get breath in her sick breast, and then raised his hand to her lips. "Marcus." "What, dear one?" "Do not weep for me, and remember this, thou wilt come to me. I have lived a short time, but God gave thy soul to me, hence I shall tell Christ that though I died, and thou wert looking at my death, though thou wert left in grief, thou didst not blaspheme against his will, and that thou lovest him always. Thou wilt love him, and endure my death patiently. For then he will unite us. I love thee and I wish to be with thee." Breath failed her then, and in a barely audible voice she finished, "Promise me this, Marcus." Vinicius embraced her with trembling arms, and said, "By thy sacred head." "I promise." Her pale face became radiant in the sad light of the moon, and once more she raised his hand to her lips, and whispered, "I am thy wife." Beyond the wall the praetorians playing Scripto Duodecim raised a louder dispute, but Vinicius and Lygia forgot the prison, the guards, the world, and, feeling within them the souls of angels, they began to pray. Chapter 60. For 3 days, or rather 3 nights, nothing disturbed their peace. When the usual prison work was finished, which consisted in separating the dead from the living and the grievously sick from those in better health, when the wearied guards had lain down to sleep in the corridors, Vinicius entered Lygia's dungeon and remained there till daylight. She put her head on his breast, and they talked in low voices of love and of death. In thought and speech, in desires and hopes even, both were removed unconsciously more and more from life, and they lost the sense of it. Both were like people who, having sailed from land in a ship, saw the shore no more, and were sinking gradually into infinity. Both changed by degrees into sad souls in love with each other and with Christ, and ready to fly away. Only at times did pain start up in the heart of Vinicius like a whirlwind. At times there flashed in him like lightning, hope, born of love and faith in the crucified God, but he tore himself away more and more each day from the earth, and yielded to death. In the morning, when he went from the prison, he looked on the world, on the city, on acquaintances, on vital interests, as through a dream. Everything seemed to him strange, distant, vain, fleeting. Even torture ceased to terrify, since one might pass through it while sunk in thought and with eyes fixed on another thing. It seemed to both that eternity had begun to receive them. They conversed of how they would love and live together, but beyond the grave, and if their thoughts returned to the earth at intervals, these were thoughts of people who, setting out on a long journey, speak of preparations for the road. Moreover, they were surrounded by such silence as in some desert surrounds two columns far away and forgotten. Their only care was that Christ should not separate them, and as each moment strengthened their conviction that he would not, they loved him as a link uniting them in endless happiness and peace. While still on earth, the dust of earth fell from them. The soul of each was as pure as a tear. Under terror of death, amid misery and suffering, in that prison den, heaven had begun, for she had taken him by the hand, and, as if saved and a saint, had led him to the source of endless life. Petronius was astonished at seeing in the face of Vinicius increasing peace and a certain wonderful serenity which he had not noted before. At times even he supposed that Vinicius had found some mode of rescue, and he was piqued because his nephew had not confided his hopes to him. At last, unable to restrain himself, he said, "Now thou hast another look. Do not keep from me secrets, for I wish and am able to aid thee." "Hast thou arranged anything?" "I have," said Vinicius, "but thou canst not help me. After her death I will confess that I am a Christian and follow her." "Then thou hast no hope?" "On the contrary, I have. Christ will give her to me, and I shall never be separated from her." Petronius began to walk in the atrium. Disillusion and impatience were evident on his face. "Thy Christ is not needed for this. Our Thanatos, death, can render the same service." Vinicius smiled sadly, and said, "No, my dear, thou art unwilling to understand." "I am unwilling and unable." "It is not the time for discussion, but remember what I said when we failed to free her from the Tullianum. I lost all hope, and on the way home thou didst say, 'But I believe that Christ can restore her to me.' Let him restore her. If I throw a costly goblet into the sea, no god of ours can give it back to me. If yours is no better, I know not why I should honor him beyond the old ones. But he will restore her to me." Petronius shrugged his shoulders. "Dost know," inquired he, "that Christians are to illuminate Caesar's gardens tomorrow?" "Tomorrow?" repeated Vinicius. And in view of the near and dreadful reality his heart trembled with pain and fear. "This is the last night, perhaps, which I can pass with Lygia," thought he. So bidding farewell to Petronius, he went hurriedly to the overseer of the putrid pits for his tessera. But disappointment was in waiting. The overseer would not give the tessera. "Pardon me," said he, "I have done what I could for thee, but I cannot risk my life. Tonight they are to conduct the Christians to Caesar's gardens. The prisons will be full of soldiers and officials. Shouldst thou be recognized, I and my children would be lost." Vinicius understood that it would be vain to insist. The hope gleamed in him, however, that the soldiers who had seen him before would admit him even without a tessera. So, with the coming of night, he disguised himself as usual in the tunic of a corpse-bearer, and, winding a cloth around his head, betook himself to the prison. But that day the tessera were verified with greater care than usual, and what was more, the centurion Cienkiewicz, a strict soldier, devoted soul and body to Caesar, recognized Vinicius. But evidently in his ironclad breast there glimmered yet some spark of pity for misfortunes. Instead of striking his spear in token of alarm, he led Vinicius aside and said, "Return to thy house, Lord. I recognize thee, but not wishing thy ruin, I am silent. I cannot admit thee. Go thy way, and may the gods send thee solace." "Thou canst not admit me," said Vinicius, "but let me stand here and look at those who are led forth." "My order does not forbid that," said Cienkiewicz. Vinicius stood before the gate and waited. About midnight the prison gate was opened widely, and whole ranks of prisoners appeared, men, women, and children, surrounded by armed praetorians. The night was very bright, hence it was possible to distinguish not only the forms, but the faces of the unfortunates. They went two abreast, in a long, gloomy train, amid stillness broken only by the clatter of weapons. So many were led out that all the dungeons must be empty, as it seemed. In the rear of the line Vinicius saw Glaucus the physician distinctly, but Lygia and Ursus were not among the condemned. Chapter 61. Darkness had not come when the first waves of people began to flow into Caesar's gardens. The crowds, in holiday costume, crowned with flowers, joyous, singing, and some of them drunk, were going to look at the new, magnificent spectacle. Shouts of Samixii Saramentiti were heard on the Via Tecta, on the bridge of Emilius, and from the other side of the Tiber, on the Triumphal Way, around the Circus of Nero, and off towards the Vatican Hill. In Rome people had been seen burnt on pillars before, but never had anyone seen such a number of victims. Caesar Antigellinus, wishing to finish at once with the Christians and also to avoid infection, which from the prisons was spreading more and more through the city, had given commands to empty all dungeons, so that there remained in them barely a few tens of people intended for the close of the spectacles. So, when the crowds had passed the gates, they were dumb with amazement. All the main and side alleys, which lay through dense groves and along lawns, thickets, ponds, fields, and squares filled with flowers, were packed with pillars smeared with pitch, to which Christians were fastened. In higher places, where the view was not hindered by trees, one could see whole rows of pillars and bodies decked with flowers, myrtle, and ivy, extending into the distance on high and low places, so far that, though the nearest were like masts of ships, the farthest seemed colored darts, or staffs thrust into the earth. The number of them surpassed the expectation of the multitude. One might suppose that a whole nation had been lashed to pillars for Rome's amusement and for Caesar's. The throng of spectators stopped before single masts when their curiosity was roused by the form or the sex of the victim. They looked at the faces, the crowns, the garlands of ivy. Then they went farther and farther, asking themselves with amazement, could there have been so many criminals, or how could children barely able to walk have set fire to Rome? And astonishment passed by degrees into fear. Meanwhile darkness came, and the first stars twinkled in the sky. Near each condemned person a slave took his place, torch in hand. When the sound of trumpets was heard in various parts of the gardens, in sign that the spectacle was to begin, each slave put his torch to the foot of a pillar. The straw, hidden under the flowers and steeped in pitch, burned at once with a bright flame which, increasing every instant, withered the ivy, and rising embraced the feet of the victims. The people were silent. The gardens resounded with one immense groan and with cries of pain. Some victims, however, raising their faces toward the starry sky, began to sing, praising Christ. The people listened. But the hardest hearts were filled with terror when, on smaller pillars, children cried with shrill voices, "Mama, Mama!" A shiver ran through even spectators who were drunk when they saw little heads and innocent faces distorted with pain, or children fainting in the smoke which began to stifle them. But the flames rose, and seized new crowns of roses and ivy every instant. The main and side alleys were illuminated, the groups of trees, the lawns, and the flowery squares were illuminated, the water and pools and ponds was gleaming, the trembling leaves on the trees had grown rose-colored, and all was as visible as in daylight. When the odor of burned bodies filled the gardens, slaves sprinkled between the pillars myrrh and aloes prepared purposely. In the crowds were heard here and there shouts, whether of sympathy or delight and joy, it was unknown, and they increased every moment with the fire, which embraced the pillars, climbed to the breasts of the victims, shriveled with burning breath the hair on their heads, threw veils over their blackened faces, and then shot up higher, as if showing the victory and triumph of that power which had given command to rouse it. At the very beginning of the spectacle Caesar had appeared among the people in a magnificent quadriga of the circus, drawn by 4 white steeds. He was dressed as a charioteer in the color of the greens. The court party and his. After him followed other chariots filled with courtiers in brilliant array, senators, priests, bacchants, naked and crowned, holding pitchers of wine, and partly drunk, uttering wild shouts. At the side of these were musicians dressed as fauns and satyrs, who played on stharas, formingas, flutes, and horns. In other chariots advanced matrons and maidens of Rome, drunk also and half-naked. Around the quadriga ran men who shook thyrses ornamented with ribbons, others beat drums, others scattered flowers. All that brilliant throng moved forward, shouting, "Evo!" on the widest road of the garden, amidst smoke and processions of people. Caesar, keeping near him Tigellinus and also Shiloh, in whose terror he sought to find amusement, drove the steeds himself, and, advancing at a walk, looked at the burning bodies, and heard the shouts of the multitude. Standing on the lofty gilded chariot, surrounded by a sea of people who bent to his feet, in the glitter of the fire, in the golden crown of a circus victor, he was a head above the courtiers and the crowd. He seemed a giant. His immense arms, stretched forward to hold the reins, seemed to bless the multitude. There was a smile on his face and in his blinking eyes. He shone above the throng as a sun or a deity, terrible but commanding and mighty. At times he stopped to look with more care at some maiden whose bosom had begun to shrink in the flames, or at the face of a child distorted by convulsions, and again he drove on, leading behind him a wild, excited retinue. At times he bowed to the people, then again he bent backward, drew in the golden reins, and spoke to Tigellinus. At last, when he had reached the great fountain in the middle of two crossing streets, he stepped from the quadriga, and, nodding to his attendants, mingled with the throng. He was greeted with shouts and plaudits. The Bacchants, the nymphs, the senators and Augustines, the priests, the fauns, satyrs, and soldiers surrounded him at once in an excited circle, but he, with Tigellinus on one side and Shiloh on the other, walked around the fountain, about which were burning some tens of torches. Stopping before each one, he made remarks on the victims, or jeered at the old Greek, on whose face boundless despair was depicted. At last he stood before a lofty mast decked with myrtle and ivy. The red tongues of fire had risen only to the knees of the victim, but it was impossible to see his face, for the green burning twigs had covered it with smoke. After a while, however, the light breeze of night turned away the smoke and uncovered the head of a man with gray beard falling on his breast. At sight of him Shiloh was twisted into a lump like a wounded snake, and from his mouth came a cry more like calling than a human voice. Glaucus, Glaucus. In fact, Glaucus the physician looked down from the burning pillar at him. Glaucus was alive yet. His face expressed pain, and was inclined forward, as if to look closely for the last time at his executioner, at the man who had betrayed him, robbed him of wife and children, set a murderer on him, and who, when all this had been forgiven in the name of Christ, had delivered him to executioners. Never had one person inflicted more dreadful or bloody wrongs on another. Now the victim was burning on the pitched pillar, and the executioner was standing at his feet. The eyes of Glaucus did nor leave the face of the Greek. At moments they were hidden by smoke, but when the breeze blew this away, Shiloh saw again those eyes fixed on him. He rose and tried to flee, but had not strength. All at once his legs seemed of lead, an invisible hand seemed to hold him at the pillar with superhuman force. He was petrified. He felt that something was overflowing in him, something giving way. He felt that he had had a surfeit of blood and torture, that the end of his life was approaching, that everything was vanishing, Caesar, the court, the multitude, and around him was only a kind of bottomless, dreadful black vacuum with no visible thing in it, save those eyes of a martyr which were summoning him to judgment. But Glaucus, bending his head lower down, looked at him fixedly. Those present divined that something was taking place between those two men. Laughter died on their lips, however, for in Shiloh's face there was something terrible. Such pain and fear had distorted it as if those tongues of fire were burning his body. On a sudden he staggered, and, stretching his arms upward, cried in a terrible and piercing voice, Glaucus, in Christ's name, forgive me. It grew silent round about, a quiver ran through the spectators, and all eyes were raised involuntarily. The head of the martyr moved slightly, and from the top of the mast was heard a voice like a groan, I forgive. Shiloh threw himself on his face, and howled like a wild beast, grasping earth in both hands. He sprinkled it on his head. Meanwhile the flames shot up, seizing the breast and face of Glaucus. They unbound the myrtle crown on his head, and seized the ribbons on the top of the pillar, the whole of which shone with great blazing. Shiloh stood up after a while with face so changed that to the Augustines he seemed another man. His eyes flashed with a light new to him, ecstasy issued from his wrinkled forehead. The Greek, incompetent a short time before, looked now like some priest visited by a divinity and ready to reveal unknown truths. "What is the matter? Has he gone mad?" asked a number of voices. But he turned to the multitude, and, raising his right hand, cried, or rather shouted, in a voice so piercing that not only the Augustines but the multitude heard him, Roman people, I swear by my death, that innocent persons are perishing here. That is the incendiary." And he pointed his finger at Nero. Then came a moment of silence. The courtiers were benumbed. Shiloh continued to stand with outstretched, trembling arm, and with finger pointed at Nero. All at once a tumult arose. The people, like a wave, urged by a sudden whirlwind, rushed toward the old man to look at him more closely. Here and there were heard cries, "Hold!" In another place, "Woe to us!" In the throng a hissing and uproar began. Ahenobarbus, matricide, incendiary. Disorder increased every instant. The Bacchants screamed in heaven-piercing voices, and began to hide in the chariots. Then some pillars which were burned through, fell, scattered sparks, and increased the confusion. A blind dense wave of people swept away Shiloh, and bore him to the depth of the garden. The pillars began to burn through in every direction and fall across the streets, filling alleys with smoke, sparks, the odor of burnt wood and burnt flesh. The nearer lights died. The gardens began to grow dark. The crowds, alarmed, gloomy, and disturbed, pressed toward the gates. News of what had happened passed from mouth to mouth, distorted and increased. Some said that Caesar had fainted, others that he had confessed, saying that he had given command to burn Rome, others that he had fallen seriously ill, and still others that he had been borne out, as if dead, in the chariot. Here and there were heard voices of sympathy for the Christians. If they had not burned Rome, why so much blood, torture, and injustice? Will not the gods avenge the innocent? And what piacula can mollify them now? The words in Optia Corpora were repeated oftener and oftener. Women expressed aloud their pity for children thrown in such numbers to wild beasts, nailed to crosses or burned in those cursed gardens. And finally pity was turned into abuse of Caesar and Tigellinus. There were persons, too, who, stopping suddenly, asked themselves or others the question, what kind of divinity is that which gives such strength to meet torture and death? And they returned home in meditation. But Shiloh was wandering about in the gardens, not knowing where to go or where to turn. Again he felt himself a weak, helpless, sick old man. Now he stumbled against partly burnt bodies. Now he struck a torch, which sent a shower of sparks after him. Now he sat down, and looked around with vacant stare. The gardens had become almost dark. The pale moon moving among the trees shone with uncertain light on the alleys, the dark pillars lying across them, and the partly burned victims turned into shapeless lumps. But the old Greek thought that in the moon he saw the face of Glaucus, whose eyes were looking at him yet persistently, and he hid before the light. At last he went out of the shadow, in spite of himself, as if pushed by some hidden power. He turned toward the fountain where Glaucus had yielded up the spirit. Then some hand touched his shoulder. He turned, and saw an unknown person before him. "Who art thou?" exclaimed he, with terror. "Paul of Tarsus." "I am accursed." "What dost thou wish?" "I wish to save thee," answered the apostle. Shiloh supported himself against a tree. His legs bent under him, and his arms hung parallel with his body. "For me there is no salvation," said he, gloomily. "Hast thou heard how God forgave the thief on the cross who pitied him?" inquired Paul. "Dost thou know what I have done?" "I saw thy suffering, and heard thy testimony to the truth, O Lord. And if a servant of Christ forgave thee in the hour of torture and death, why should Christ not forgive thee?" Shiloh seized his head with both hands, as if in bewilderment. "Forgiveness." "For me, forgiveness." "Our God is a God of mercy," said Paul. "For me," repeated Shiloh, and he began to groan like a man who lacks strength to control his pain and suffering. "Lean on me," said Paul, "and go with me." And taking him he went to the crossing of the streets, guided by the voice of the fountain, which seemed to weep in the night stillness over the bodies of those who had died in torture. "Our God is a God of mercy," repeated the apostle. "Wert thou to stand at the sea and cast in pebbles, couldst thou fill its depth with them? I tell thee that the mercy of Christ is as the sea, and that the sins and faults of men sink in it as pebbles in the abyss. I tell thee that it is like the sky which covers mountains, lands, and seas, for it is everywhere and has neither end nor limit. Thou hast suffered at the pillar of Glaucus. Christ saw thy suffering. Without reference to what may meet thee tomorrow, thou didst say, that is the incendiary, and Christ remembers thy words. Thy malice and falsehood are gone. In thy heart is left only boundless sorrow. Follow me and listen to what I say. I am he who hated Christ and persecuted his chosen ones. I did not want him, I did not believe in him till he manifested himself and called me. Since then he is, for me, mercy. He has visited thee with compunction, with alarm, and with pain, to call thee to himself. Thou didst hate him, but he loved thee. Thou didst deliver his confessors to torture, but he wishes to forgive and save thee. Immense sobbing shook the breast of the wretched man, sobbing by which the soul in him was rent to its depths. But Paul took possession of him, mastered him, led him away, as a soldier leads a captive. After a while the apostle began again to speak: Come with me, I will lead thee to him, for why else have I come to thee? Christ commanded me to gather in souls in the name of love, hence I perform his service. Thou thinkest thyself accursed, but I say, believe in him, and salvation awaits thee. Thou thinkest that thou art hated, but I repeat that he loves thee. Look at me. Before I had him I had nothing save malice, which dwelt in my heart, and now his love suffices me instead of father and mother, wealth and power. In him alone is refuge. He alone will see thy sorrow, believe in thy misery, remove thy alarm, and raise thee to himself. Thus speaking, he led him to the fountain, the silver stream of which gleamed from afar in the moonlight. Round about was silence. The gardens were empty, for slaves had removed the charred pillars and the bodies of the martyrs. Shiloh threw himself on his knees with a groan, and hiding his face in his hands remained motionless. Paul raised his face to the stars. O Lord, prayed he, look on this wretched man, on his sorrow, his tears, and his suffering. O God of mercy, who hast shed thy blood for our sins, forgive him, through thy torment, thy death and resurrection. Then he was silent, but for a long time he looked toward the stars, and prayed. Meanwhile from under his feet was heard a cry which resembled a groan. O Christ, forgive me. Paul approached the fountain then, and, taking water in his hand, turned to the kneeling wretch. Shiloh, I baptize thee in the name of the Father, Son, and Spirit. Amen. Shiloh raised his head, opened his arms, and remained in that posture. The moon shone with full light on his white hair and on his equally white face, which was as motionless as if dead or cut out of stone. The moments passed one after another. From the great aviaries in the gardens of Domitian came the crowing of cocks, but Shiloh remained kneeling, like a statue on a monument. At last he recovered, spoke to the apostle, and asked, What am I to do before death? Paul was roused also from meditation on the measureless power which even such spirits as that of this Greek could not resist, and answered, Have faith, and bear witness to the truth. They went out together. At the gate the apostle blessed the old man again, and they parted. Shiloh himself insisted on this, for after what had happened he knew that Caesar and Tigellinus would give command to pursue him. Indeed he was not mistaken. When he returned home, he found the house surrounded by praetorians, who led him away, and took him under direction of Sevenus to the Palatine. Caesar had gone to rest, but Tigellinus was waiting. When he saw the unfortunate Greek, he greeted him with a combat ominous face. Thou hast committed the crime of treason, said he, and punishment will not pass thee, but if tomorrow thou testify in the amphitheater that thou wert drunk and mad, and that the authors of the conflagration are Christians, thy punishment will be limited to stripes and exile. I cannot do that, answered Shiloh, calmly. Tigellinus approached him with slow step, and with a voice also low but terrible. How is that? Asked he. Thou canst not, Greek dog. Wert thou not drunk, and dost thou not understand what is waiting for thee? Look there. And he pointed to a corner of the atrium in which, near a long wooden bench, stood 4 Thracian slaves in the shade with ropes, and with pincers in their hands. But Shiloh answered, I cannot. Rage seized Tigellinus, but he restrained himself yet. Hast thou seen, inquired he, how Christians die? Dost wish to die in that way? The old man raised his pale face, for a time his lips moved in silence, and he answered, I too believe in Christ. Tigellinus looked at him with amazement. Dog, thou hast gone mad in fact. And suddenly the rage in his breast broke its bounds. Springing at Shiloh, he caught him by the beard with both hands, hurled him to the floor, trampled him, repeating, with foam on his lips, Thou wilt retract. Thou wilt. I cannot, answered Shiloh from the floor. To the tortures with him. At this command the Thracians seized the old man, and placed him on the bench. Then, Fastening him with ropes to it, they began to squeeze his thin shanks with pincers. But when they were tying him he kissed their hands with humility. Then he closed his eyes, and seemed dead. He was alive, though, for when Tigellinus bent over him and inquired once again, "Wilt thou retract?" his white lips moved slightly, and from them came the barely audible whisper, "I cannot." Tigellinus gave command to stop the torture, and began to walk up and down in the atrium with a face distorted by anger, but helpless. At last a new idea came to his head, for he turned to the Thracians and said, "Tear out his tongue." Chapter 62. The drama Aurelius was given usually in theaters or amphitheaters, so arranged that they could open and present as it were two separate stages. But after the spectacle in the gardens of Caesar the usual method was omitted, for in this case the problem was to let the greatest number of people look at a slave who, in the drama, is devoured by a bear. In the theaters the role of the bear is played by an actor sewed up in a skin, but this time the representation was to be real. This was a new idea of Tigellinus. At first Caesar refused to come, but changed his mind at persuasion of the favorite. Tigellinus explained that after what had happened in the gardens it was all the more his duty to appear before the people, and he guaranteed that the crucified slave would not insult him as had Crispus. The people were somewhat sated and tired of blood spilling, hence a new distribution of lottery tickets and gifts was promised, as well as a feast, for the spectacle was to be in the evening, in a brilliantly lighted amphitheater. About dusk the whole amphitheater was packed. The Augustines, with Tigellinus at the head of them, came to a man, not only for the spectacle itself, but to show their devotion to Caesar and their opinion of Shiloh, of whom all Rome was then talking. They whispered to one another that Caesar, when returning from the gardens, had fallen into a frenzy and could not sleep, that terrors and wonderful visions had attacked him, therefore he had announced on the following morning his early journey to Achaia. But others denied this, declaring that he would be all the more pitiless to the Christians. Cowards, however, were not lacking, who foresaw that the accusation which Shiloh had thrown into Caesar's face might have the worst result possible. In conclusion, there were those who through humanity begged Tigellinus to stop persecution. "See whither ye are going," said Marcus Sirenus. "Ye wished to allay people's anger and convince them that punishment was falling on the guilty. The result is just the opposite." "True," added Antistius Verus. "All whisper to one another now that the Christians were innocent." "If that be cleverness, Shiloh was right when he said that your brains could be held in a nutshell." Tigellinus turned to them and said, "Marcus Sirenus, people whisper also to one another that thy daughter Servilia secreted her Christian slaves from Caesar's justice. They say the same also of thy wife, Antistius." "That is not true," exclaimed Marcus, with alarm. "Your divorced women wished to ruin my wife, whose virtue they envy," said Antistius Verus, with no less alarm. "But others spoke of Shiloh." "What has happened to him?" asked Appius Marcellus. "He delivered them himself into the hands of Tigellinus. From a beggar he became rich. It was possible for him to live out his days in peace, have a splendid funeral, and a tomb. But, no, all at once he preferred to lose everything and destroy himself. He must, in truth, be a maniac." "Not a maniac, but he has become a Christian," said Tigellinus. "Impossible," said Vitellius. "Have I not said," put in Vestinius, "kill Christians if ye like, but believe me ye cannot war with their divinity. With it there is no jesting. See what is taking place. I have not burned Rome, but if Caesar permitted I would give a hecatomb at once to their divinity, and all should do the same, for I repeat, with it there is no jesting. Remember my words to you." "And I said something else," added Petronius. "Tigellinus laughed when I said that they were arming, but I say more, they are conquering." "How is that? How is that?" inquired a number of voices. "By Pollux, they are. For if such a man as Shiloh could not resist them, who can? If ye think that after every spectacle the Christians do not increase, become coppersmiths, or go to shaving beards, for then ye will know better what people think, and what is happening in the city." "He speaks pure truth, by the sacred Peplus of Diana," cried Vestinius. But Barcus turned to Petronius. "What is thy conclusion?" "I conclude where ye began. There has been enough of bloodshed." Tigellinus looked at him jeeringly. A little more." "If thy head is not sufficient, thou hast another on thy cane," said Petronius. Further conversation was interrupted by the coming of Caesar, who occupied his place in company with Pythagoras. Immediately after began the representation of Aurelius, to which not much attention was paid, for the minds of the audience were fixed on Shiloh. The spectators, familiar with blood and torture, were bored. They hissed, gave out shouts uncomplimentary to the court, and demanded the bear scene, which for them was the only thing of interest. Had it not been for gifts and the hope of seeing Shiloh, the spectacle would not have held the audience. At last the looked-for moment came. Servants of the circus brought in first a wooden cross, so low that a bear standing on his hind feet might reach the martyr's breast. Then two men brought, or rather dragged in, Shiloh, for as the bones in his legs were broken, he was unable to walk alone. They laid him down and nailed him to the wood so quickly that the curious Augustines had not even a good look at him. And only after the cross had been fixed in the place prepared for it did all eyes turn to the victim. But it was a rare person who could recognize in that naked man the former Shiloh. After the tortures which Tigellinus had commanded, there was not one drop of blood in his face, and only on his white beard was evident the red trace left by blood after they had torn his tongue out. Through the transparent skin it was quite possible to see his bones. He seemed far older also, almost decrepit. Formerly his eyes cast glances ever filled with disquiet and ill will, his watchful face reflected constant alarm and uncertainty. Now his face had an expression of pain, but it was as mild and calm as faces of the sleeping or the dead. Perhaps remembrance of that thief on the cross whom Christ had forgiven lent him confidence. Perhaps, also, he said in his soul to the merciful God, "O Lord, I bit like a venomous worm, but all my life I was unfortunate. I was famishing from hunger, people trampled on me, beat me, jeered at me. I was poor and very unhappy, and now they put me to torture and nail me to a cross. But thou, O merciful, wilt not reject me in this hour." Peace descended evidently into his crushed heart. No one laughed, for there was in that crucified man something so calm, he seemed so old, so defenseless, so weak, calling so much for pity with his lowliness, that each one asked himself unconsciously how it was possible to torture and nail to crosses men who would die soon in any case. The crowd was silent. Among the Augustines Vestinius, bending to right and left, whispered in a terrified voice, "See how they die." Others were looking for the bear, wishing the spectacle to end at the earliest. The bear came into the arena at last, and, swaying from side to side a head which hung low, he looked around from beneath his forehead, as if thinking of something or seeking something. At last he saw the cross and the naked body. He approached it, and stood on his hind legs, but after a moment he dropped again on his forepaws, and sitting under the cross began to growl, as if in his heart of a beast pity for that remnant of a man had made itself heard. Cries were heard from circus slaves urging on the bear, but the people were silent. Meanwhile Shiloh raised his head with slow motion, and for a time moved his eyes over the audience. At last his glance rested somewhere on the highest rows of the amphitheater, his breast moved with more life, and something happened which caused wonder and astonishment. That face became bright with a smile, a ray of light, as it were, encircled that forehead. His eyes were uplifted before death, and after a while two great tears which had risen between the lids flowed slowly down his face, and he died. At that same moment a resonant manly voice high up under the velarium exclaimed, "Peace to the martyrs." Deep silence reigned in the amphitheater. Chapter 63. After the spectacle in Caesar's gardens the prisons were emptied considerably. It is true that victims suspected of the Oriental superstition were seized yet and imprisoned, but pursuit brought in fewer and fewer persons, barely enough for coming exhibitions, which were to follow quickly. People were sated with blood. They showed growing wariness, and increasing alarm because of the unparalleled conduct of the condemned. Fears like those of the superstitious Vestinius seized thousands of people. Among the crowds tales more and more wonderful were related of the vengefulness of the Christian god. Present typhus, which had spread through the city, increased the general dread. The number of funerals was evident, and it was repeated from ear to ear that fresh piacula were needed to mollify the unknown god. Offerings were made in the temples to Jove and Libertina. At last, in spite of every effort of Tigellinus and his assistants, the opinion kept spreading that the city had been burned at command of Caesar, and that the Christians were suffering innocently. But for this very reason Nero and Tigellinus were untiring in persecution. To calm the multitude, fresh orders were issued to distribute wheat, wine, and olives. To relieve owners, new rules were published to facilitate the building of houses, and others touching width of streets and materials to be used in building so as to avoid fires in future. Caesar himself attended sessions of the Senate, and counseled with the fathers on the good of the people and the city, but not a shadow of favor fell on the doomed. The ruler of the world was anxious, above all, to fix in people's minds a conviction that such merciless punishments could strike only the guilty. In the Senate no voice was heard on behalf of the Christians, for no one wished to offend Caesar, and besides, those who looked farther into the future insisted that the foundations of Roman rule could not stand against the new faith. The dead and the dying were given to their relatives, as Roman law took no vengeance on the dead. Vinicius received a certain solace from the thought that if Lygia died he would bury her in his family tomb, and rest near her. At that time he had no hope of rescuing her. Half separated from life, he was himself wholly absorbed in Christ, and dreamed no longer of any union except an eternal one. His faith had become simply boundless, for eternity seemed something incomparably truer and more real than the fleeting life which he had lived up to that time. His heart was overflowing with concentrated enthusiasm. Though yet alive, he had changed into a being almost immaterial, which desiring complete liberation for itself desired it also for another. He imagined that when free he and Lygia would each take the other's hand and go to heaven, where Christ would bless them, and let them live in light as peaceful and boundless as the light of dawn. He merely implored Christ to spare Lygia the torments of the circus, and let her fall asleep calmly in prison. He felt with perfect certainty that he himself would die at the same time. In view of the sea of blood which had been shed, he did not even think it permitted to hope that she alone would be spared. He had heard from Peter and Paul that they, too, must die as martyrs. The sight of Shiloh on the cross had convinced him that even a martyr's death could be sweet, hence he wished it for Lygia and himself as the change of an evil, sad, and oppressive fate for a better. At times he had a foretaste of life beyond the grave. That sadness which hung over the souls of both was losing its former burning bitterness, and changing gradually into a kind of trans-terrestrial, calm abandon to the will of God. Vinicius, who formerly had toiled against the current, had struggled and tortured himself, yielded now to the stream, believing that it would bear him to eternal calm. He divined, too, that Lygia, as well as he, was preparing for death, that, in spite of the prison walls separating them, they were advancing together, and he smiled at that thought as at happiness. In fact, they were advancing with as much agreement as if they had exchanged thoughts every day for a long time. Neither had Lygia any desire, any hope, save the hope of a life beyond the grave. Death was presented to her not only as a liberation from the terrible walls of the prison, from the hands of Caesar and Tigellinus, not only as liberation, but as the hour of her marriage to Vinicius. In view of this unshaken certainty, all else lost importance. After death would come her happiness, which was even earthly, so that she waited for it also as a betrothed waits for the wedding day. And that immense current of faith, which swept away from life and bore beyond the grave thousands of those first confessors, bore away Ursus also. Neither had he in his heart been resigned to Lygia's death. But when day after day through the prison walls came news of what was happening in the amphitheaters and the gardens, when death seemed the common, inevitable lot of all Christians and also their good, higher than all mortal conceptions of happiness, he did not dare to pray to Christ to deprive Lygia of that happiness or to delay it for long years. In his simple barbarian soul he thought, besides, that more of those heavenly delights would belong to the daughter of the Lygian chief, that she would have more of them than would a whole crowd of simple ones to whom he himself belonged, and that in eternal glory she would sit nearer to the Lamb than would others. He had heard, it is true, that before God men are equal, but a conviction was lingering at the bottom of his soul that the daughter of a leader, and besides of a leader of all the Lygians, was not the same as the first slave one might meet. He hoped also that Christ would let him continue to serve her. His one secret wish was to die on a cross as the Lamb died. But this seemed a happiness so great that he hardly dared to pray for it, though he knew that in Rome even the worst criminals were crucified. He thought that surely he would be condemned to die under the teeth of wild beasts, and this was his one sorrow. From childhood he had lived in impassable forests, amid continual hunts, in which, thanks to his superhuman strength, he was famous among the Lygians even before he had grown to manhood. This occupation had become for him so agreeable that later, When in Rome, and forced to live without hunting, he went to vivaria and amphitheaters just to look at beasts known and unknown to him. The sight of these always roused in the man an irresistible desire for struggle and killing, so now he feared in his soul that on meeting them in the amphitheater he would be attacked by thoughts unworthy of a Christian, whose duty it was to die piously and patiently. But in this he committed himself to Christ, and found other and more agreeable thoughts to comfort him. Hearing that the Lamb had declared war against the powers of hell and evil spirits with which the Christian faith connected all pagan divinities, he thought that in this war he might serve the Lamb greatly, and serve better than others, for he could not help believing that his soul was stronger than the souls of other martyrs. Finally, he prayed whole days, rendered service to prisoners, helped overseers, and comforted his queen, who complained at times that in her short life she had not been able to do so many good deeds as the renowned Tabitha of whom Peter the Apostle had told her. Even the prison guards, who feared the terrible strength of this giant, since neither bars nor chains could restrain it, came to love him at last for his mildness. Amazed at his good temper, they asked more than once what its cause was. He spoke with such firm certainty of the life waiting after death for him, that they listened with surprise, seeing for the first time that happiness might penetrate a dungeon which sunlight could not reach. And when he urged them to believe in the Lamb, it occurred to more than one of those people that his own service was the service of a slave, his own life the life of an unfortunate, and he fell to thinking over his evil fate, the only end to which was death. But death brought new fear, and promised nothing beyond, while that giant and that maiden, who was like a flower cast on the straw of the prison, went toward it with delight, as toward the gates of happiness. Chapter 64. One evening Sienkiewicz, a senator, visited Petronius and began a long conversation, touching the grievous times in which they were living, and also touching Caesar. He spoke so openly that Petronius, though his friend, began to be cautious. Sienkiewicz complained that the world was living madly and unjustly, that all must end in some catastrophe more dreadful still than the burning of Rome. He said that even Augustines were dissatisfied, that Fenius Rufus, second prefect of the Praetorians, endured with the greatest effort the vile orders of Tigellinus, and that all Seneca's relatives were driven to extremes by Caesar's conduct as well toward his old master as toward Lucan. Finally, he began to hint of the dissatisfaction of the people, and even of the Praetorians, the greater part of whom had been won by Fenius Rufus. "Why dost thou say this?" inquired Petronius. "Out of care for Caesar," said Sienkiewicz. "I have a distant relative among the Praetorians, also Sienkiewicz. Through him I know what takes place in the camp. Disaffection is growing there also. Caligula, knowest thou, was mad too, and see what happened. Cassius' tree appeared. That was a dreadful deed, and surely there is no one among us to praise it. Still Tree freed the world of a monster." Is thy meaning as follows: "I do not praise Tree, but he was a perfect man, and would that the gods had given us as many such as possible?" inquired Petronius. But Sienkiewicz changed the conversation, and began all at once to praise Piso, exalting his family, his nobility of mind, his attachment to his wife, and, finally, his intellect, his calmness, and his wonderful gift of winning people. "Caesar is childless," said he, "and I'll see a successor in Piso. Doubtless, too, every man would help him with whole soul to gain power. Fenius Rufus loves him, the relatives of Annius are devoted to him altogether. Plautius Lateranus and Tullius Seneca would spring into fire for him, as would Nadalus, and Subrius Flavius, and Sulpicius Asper, and Afranius Quintianus, and even Vestinius. From this last man not much will result to Piso," replied Petronius. "Vestinius is afraid of his own shadow." "Vestinius fears dreams and spirits," answered Sienkiewicz, "but he is a practical man, whom people wish wisely to make consul. That in his soul he is opposed to persecuting Christians, thou shouldst not take ill of him, for it concerns thee too that this madness should cease." "Not me, but Vinicius," answered Petronius. "Out of concern for Vinicius, I should like to save a certain maiden, but I cannot, for I have fallen out of favor with Ahenobarbus." "How is that?" "Dost thou not notice that Caesar is approaching thee again, and beginning to talk with thee? And I will tell thee why. He is preparing again for Achaia, where he is to sing songs in Greek of his own composition. He is burning for that journey, but also he trembles at thought of the cynical genius of the Greeks. He imagines that either the greatest triumph may meet him or the greatest failure. He needs good counsel, and he knows that no one can give it better than thou. This is why thou art returning to favor. Lucan might take my place. Bronzebeard hates Lucan, and in his soul has written down death for the poet. He is merely seeking a pretext, for he seeks pretexts always. By Castor, said Petronius, that may be. But I might have still another way for a quick return to favor. What? To repeat to Bronzebeard what thou hast told me just now. I have said nothing, cried Sevenus, with alarm. Petronius placed his hand upon the senator's shoulder. Thou hast called Caesar a madman, thou hast foreseen the heirship of Piso, and hast said, Lucan understands that there is need to hasten. What wouldst thou hasten, Chrysim? Sevenus grew pale, and for a moment each looked into the eyes of the other. Thou wilt not repeat. By the hips of Cypris, I will not. How well thou knowest me. No, I will not repeat. I have heard nothing, and, moreover, I wish to hear nothing. Dost understand? Life is too short to make any undertaking worth the while. I beg thee only to visit Tigellinus today, and talk with him as long as thou hast with me of whatever may please thee. Why? So that should Tigellinus ever say to me, Sevenus was with thee, I might answer, he was with thee, too, that very day. Sevenus, when he heard this, broke the ivory cane which he had in his hand, and said, May the evil fall on this stick. I shall be with Tigellinus today, and later at Nerva's feast. Thou, too, wilt be there? In every case till we meet in the amphitheater, where the last of the Christians will appear the day after tomorrow. Till we meet. After tomorrow, repeated Petronius, when alone. There is no time to lose. Ahenobarbus will need me really in Achaia, hence he may count with me. And he determined to try the last means. In fact, at Nerva's feast Caesar himself asked that Petronius recline opposite, for he wished to speak with the arbiter about Achaia and the cities in which he might appear with hopes of the greatest success. He cared most for the Athenians, whom he feared. Other Augustines listened to this conversation with attention, so as to seize crumbs of the arbiter's opinions, and give them out later on as their own. It seems to me that I have not lived up to this time, said Nero, and that my birth will come only in Greece. Thou wilt be born to new glory and immortality, answered Petronius. I trust that this is true, and that Apollo will not seem jealous. If I return in triumph, I will offer him such a hecatomb as no god has had so far. Sevenus fell to repeating the lines of Horace: Sic te divipatum Cypri, sic fratres Helene, lucida Sidra, venturum cregat pater. The vessel is ready at Naples, said Caesar. I should like to go even tomorrow. At this Petronius rose, and, looking straight into Nero's eyes, said, Permit me, O divinity, to celebrate a wedding feast, to which I shall invite thee before others. A wedding feast? What wedding feast? Inquired Nero. That of Vinicius with thy hostage, the daughter of the Lygian king. She is in prison at present, it is true, but as a hostage she is not subject to imprisonment, and, secondly, thou thyself hast permitted Vinicius to marry her, and as thy sentences, like those of Zeus, are unchangeable, thou wilt give command to free her from prison, and I will give her to thy favorite. The cool blood and calm self-possession with which Petronius spoke disturbed Nero, who was disturbed whenever anyone spoke in that fashion to him. I know, said he, dropping his eyes. I have thought of her and of that giant who killed Croton. In that case both are saved, answered Petronius, calmly. But Tigellinus came to the aid of his master. She is in prison by the will of Caesar. Thou thyself hast said, O Petronius, that his sentences are unchangeable. All present, knowing the history of Vinicius and Lygia, understood perfectly what the question was, hence they were silent, curious as to the end of the conversation. She is in prison against the will of Caesar and through thy error, through thy ignorance of the law of nations, said Petronius, with emphasis. Thou art a naive man, Tigellinus, but even thou wilt not assert that she burnt Rome, and if thou wert to do so, Caesar would not believe thee. But Nero had recovered and begun to half close his nearsighted eyes with an expression of indescribable malice. Petronius is right, said he, after a while. Tigellinus looked at him with amazement. Petronius is right, repeated Nero, tomorrow the gates of the prison will be opened to her, and of the marriage feast we will speak the day after at the amphitheater. I have lost again, thought Petronius. When he had returned home, he was so certain that the end of Lygia's life had come that he sent a trusty freedman to the amphitheater to bargain with the chief of the spoliarium for the delivery of her body, since he wished to give it to Vinicius.